right, let's stay with this issue now and speak to Ernst van Zyl, who's with AfriForum, Matthew Parks, Cosatu spokesperson, Hermann Pretorius, here with us in studio from the South African Institute for Race Relations, and Professor Ruth Hall, who's with the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you so much for your time. So, Professor Hall, I'm going to start with you. Some have said that the signing of this bill is a step in the right direction. Your take?
Yes, absolutely. It's high time. In fact, it's 30 years too late. This bill brings our legislation in line with the constitutional settlement that was negotiated in 1995. It says that political transition in South Africa cannot insulate private property. There has to be a law-bound process where the state takes decisive action to restore land to people who've been dispossessed, to acquire land compulsorily, to redistribute it. And this is expropriation. It's not confiscation. There will be checks and balances. There is a court procedure. But I think importantly, there are places where this is desperately needed to overcome spatial apartheid in our cities, to acquire abandoned buildings, to deal with restitution claims that are not being addressed, to subdivide and allocate land to farm workers who are landless. This is what's needed. The question remains, is the government willing to use these powers, and exactly how?
And I'm going to come back to that because that's one of the big questions, and that's been raised by a number of people. Herman, your institute has actually been calling for Parliament to reject this for quite some time now. And you've just heard what Professor Hall has just said. Your take?
I'm familiar with Professor Hall's work, and one of the things that she constantly gets back to is this idea that this legislation gives legal certainty. It doesn't. The list of grounds under which property can be expropriated without compensation is an open-ended list. So far from giving legal certainty, as Professor Hall has argued in the past, this bill does the opposite. She also makes the point that this bill brings the expropriation legislation in line with the Constitution. Well, not Section 25(2)(b) of the Constitution, because this Act actually requires, or doesn't require, a court order before land is expropriated, contrary to what is stated in Section 25(2)(b). So the legal elements of this bill, questionable at best. Then Professor Hall also makes the point that this is to redistribute land. Well, tell that to someone like David Rakgase, a very good example of the government's efforts to gain land and control of assets, and then simply refuse to give it back to someone who is such a promising and a black farmer like Mr. Rakgase. So there are many, many problems in this bill legally that I think some people skate over. Then there's the unconstitutionality of the process, how we got here. The consultation process in the National Council of Provinces was especially a sham in terms of using a Google form and not proper accepted parliamentary procedures for making submissions. But then there's also just the plain reality that you can't have economic growth and the destruction of property rights at the same time. A healthy economy means people can work hard, earn an income, and buy things they want, and own those things securely. This Act goes against that very principle. So every country that has ever gone down this aggressive route of expropriation in an open-ended way, as this Act does, has ended up in a socio-economically dire state.
Matthew, what Herman is saying here is something that we've heard from even the Democratic Alliance. They speak about the vagueness of it all, and they say that there's uncertainty when it comes to some parts of this. How does Cosatu react to the President assenting this bill?
We welcome it. We've been extensively involved in the drafting of the Expropriation Act. It's now an act, no longer a bill, the act of the country. We've been involved with it for more than a decade. It's been to Parliament twice now. It's been extensively debated at NEDLAC. Huge amounts of public submissions to it. It was adopted in both houses of Parliament by an overwhelming majority of parties, not just the African National Congress. And look, the political premise to it is that we must address our original sin as a country. We can't be proud that we are the most unequal society in the world 30 years into democracy. We can't be complacent about millions of African, colored, Indian, especially women, people in our cities who don't own land, who have to live in backyards or on formal dwellings. We cannot be happy with people, millions of people, farm workers, labor tenants, people in rural areas, again, overwhelmingly African, colored women who don't own land in rural areas. And we can continue to ignore these crises. And the consequence will be what we saw in Zimbabwe, which will be an implosion. The devastation to Zimbabwe is what will happen to us if we don't address it. So this is not a magic wand. It's not going to resolve everything. It's not overplay its importance, but it is a useful, it is a sober, it's a constitutional tool to assist government. Because we have seen time and again when governments try to expropriate land and try to negotiate settlements with owners like Mala Mala, it was basically held to extortion, had to spend hundreds of millions of rands on these things. And the state just doesn't have the money. But the act, doesn't say that it's a Wild West. It doesn't say that government can just run around behaving like some sort of cowboy, taking whatever it wants, not paying money, etc. It's very specific. It's incredibly detailed, and it says, here's a premise for expropriation. It's in line with the Constitution. The government is required to address the legacies of the past, colonialism, apartheid, the inequalities of the past and of today. It is required to ensure people have access to land, to mineral resources, to water, and so forth. I think it's a very detailed process how you do it. How must the government engage with the owner? What is the owner's rights, including going to court? Very clear, concise timeframes. How will compensation be determined? Is it full? Is it partial? Is it nil? And when it comes to nil or zero compensation, again, it's quite detailed. It's not a blank check. It says it's state land, because they had an incident, for example, in the city of Cape Town, when the city wanted to charge some years ago an outrageous amount of money to national government for a housing project. So we need to, as the president said, about a third of the land in the country is owned by the state. Should the state really be extorting the state, for example? It says abandoned land, because we've got a lot of land by owners who have disappeared to Australia or wherever they might be. Why should government, and how should government pay for that land? It says if your property has benefited because of a state investment, then the state shouldn't compensate you for that portion. So it's not a reckless blank check. It's sober. It meets the Constitution. And in fact, it's in line with the expropriation laws of many other countries, whether it's the US, whether it's Europe, Brazil. It's not a random comic strip. It's a very sober, pragmatic, common sense law.
And Ernst, I'm going to come to you. I see that Hermann here in studio is vehemently shaking his head as Matthew is speaking. But Ernst, when you listen to Contralesa, for example, they share the same sentiments as Matthew. They say that it's not a magic wand. It's not going to solve the country's problems all at once, but it's a step in the right direction. But AfriForum is not happy?
Well, I'm very relieved that I'm sharing the room with Mr. Pretorius here, because then at least I'm sharing the room with another person who believes in the constitutional right of private property. When it comes to this bill, it is a direct onslaught against the idea of private property. When it comes to the debate regarding land, the government was serious about the redistribution of land, they would have fixed the restitution process that has been in place for decades now. But that is a restitution process that has been derailed by corruption, mismanagement, and cronyism, where land does not end up in the hands of previously expropriated from people. Land ends up in the hands of those with the right political connections, and that's a story as old as South Africa itself. I mean, every South African knows that story. When it comes to the idea of that this is now the reaction to the willing buyer, willing seller model failing, that nothing can be further from the truth. We don't have a willing buyer, willing seller model failure here. We have a problem with a hoarder of land in the government. The South African government owns more than 17 million hectares of land. Just for perspective, that's a very big number to get the picture. That is the surface area of Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal combined. If the state wants people to trust that it can handle redistribution of land properly and fairly, it should start redistributing the land that it has in its ownership, rather than trying to open the gates so that it can expropriate without compensation the land of private land owners. Then also this idea, and I agree here with Mr. Pretorius, that when it comes to the bill itself, the expropriation bill, it is marred with vagueness. It is a playground for a corrupt politician. The whole idea of public interest being the criteria, you know as well as I and your audience know that the idea of public interest is the perfect opportunity for a politician to twist any scenario into being in the public interest. And that is the problem here. This bill opens the door for corruption. It opens the door for cronyism, and it opens the door for the abolishment of private property in this country. And I'm so glad there are many sane voices standing up against it, because it is not a sane bill.
Professor Hall, you're chuckling.
Oh, I thought I had a poker face, but yes, I think that's outrageous. Firstly, we're hearing some inaccurate tropes that we've heard before. Firstly, there's an implication that the Constitution provides a blanket guarantee that all private property is sacred. It does no such thing. The Constitution's property clause provides a very clear mandate, and it tells the state it must take action to redistribute land and to achieve land justice in a country that's founded on dispossession. Secondly, there's the implication that the state doesn't need to acquire any land because it's got plenty of land. Well, if you look at what that land is, those 17 million hectares, a lot of it is the former Bantustans. Then there are national parks. There is land held for infrastructure. There is well-located public land in places where we have golf courses in Cape Town, in and around cities in certain places. Yes, there is some state land. But the one thing that matters when it comes to land is where it is. And I'll tell you 3 examples of very good reasons why there should be expropriation of specific properties of land. Firstly, where there are land restitution claims deadlocked, where you have one set of property rights holders who were dispossessed and other property rights holders who own a title deed now. Those are 2 sets of property rights in direct opposition. And the Constitution says very specifically that the state must take action to ensure justice, which means redistribution. And this Expropriation Act provides the deadlock breaking mechanism. We don't just need to have carrots of offering more and more money to landowners who then hold the process to ransom. There is a deadlock breaking mechanism. And secondly, I think that what we're also hearing is if you have a dysfunctional state that is corrupt, that doesn't manage its own resources well, we can't trust it to acquire property and to redistribute properly. Dead right. I couldn't agree more. But that is not a reason not to pursue progressive politics. What we need now is 2 things over and above the Expropriation Act. Firstly, we need a compensation policy where the state makes it clear how it wants to approach compensation. There are cases where people should be compensated more than market price. When you are dispossessing rural communities to make way for mining developments, how are they going to be left better off in the national interest? So when are you going to pay below market compensation and when nil?
Yeah.
So I think it's now time for that. But secondly, what about the rights of landless people and people who occupy land because they have nowhere else to go? So I think we should focus less on the storyline that is being presented here, which is about private landowners defending their interests versus a nasty state, and realize that we live in a country where the vast majority of people have no secure rights whatsoever.
Hermann, I'm going to come to you because now, yes, it's been years in the making for us to get to this particular point, but there's a government of national unity now. There is a minister who is a minister of the Public Works Department who is going to also be championing quite a large portion of this. Are you saying that you still don't have faith that it can be done correctly?
I mean, it's the principle that matters. Professor Hall I don't know where exactly she gets her facts. She's got a beautiful smile, but awful facts. She complains about the landless people. This act does nothing to give people land. In fact, quite the opposite. It destroys the ability of people to own land in the first place. And Matthew talks about workers in South Africa. The 1975 Act, as undemocratic and apartheid era as it was, at least provided some compensation mechanisms for workers on land that is expropriated, which this Act does not. This Act leaves farm workers of expropriated land essentially without any income, without any home, without any compensation, where the 1975 Act did so. So as an advocate for the working people in this country, I think it's quite shameful what Matthew is saying. And what Professor Hall is saying here is that dead right, a state that can't manage its own affairs shouldn't be responsible for this process. Yes, Professor, but this Act does nothing about what you care about. It only gives the power to open the patient and not do the surgery.
Are you doubting, though, that Dean McPherson can do a good job here?
I don't care if it's Mr. McPherson or my own mother who's the minister. The principle is wrong. The principle that people in this country can't work hard, earn an income, buy a house, a business, a farm that they can then securely own is actually quite apartheid era, if I might say it this way. If we're going to talk about original sin, it's quite bizarre that the 1913 Act and 1950 Act is just a repeat of what we're seeing now. Let's give the state the power to choose who can live where. And that's not even talking about the socioeconomic impacts. There's a multi-trillion rand hole in the books of South African banks because land is responsible for such a vast amount of commercial securities that Professor Hall and Matthew seem completely at ease with letting workers related to those sectors starve.
Matthew?
So I would have thought that the Institute for Race Relations would be familiar with the history of apartheid. They might come to Cape Town to a place called District 6, where people were evicted during the 1980s. Didn't get compensation. Black and coloured people got nothing.
Property
maybe
rights.
Maybe they'll get £1 or £2.
Property rights were violated,
No,
and that was
let me
bad.
finish.
Why
I
is
didn't
it
interrupt
right
you
now?
when you went on your apartheid nostalgia ticket parade.
Let's get serious.
So it's a bit
I think let's give him a chance just to respond.
It's a bit offensive to millions of people who suffered under apartheid to equate a democratic dispensation to what people went through under the apartheid era. I think one could tone down the little bit of condensation a little bit. But let's speak to the facts. The Act is not an act, by the way, it's not a bill. The Act provides legal recourse to anybody who has aggrieved. And I think our courts have shown themselves to be very assertive, to be very independent. And that's exactly why we also support it, because the majority of expropriations, as Ruth is saying, by the way, Ruth is a renowned academic, an expert in land issues. But the Expropriation Act provides for protections, because most expropriations will be from a working class community to expand a freeway, to build a school, a dam, a power station, etc. And we also, as Cosatu, want to make sure that our teachers and our nurses who have got properties, who have got bonds to the banks, will be compensated. It just provides that specifically. It's not a blank check, because we are very familiar with the issue of corruption in state capital South Africa. That's why when we went through it, we made sure that there will be protections for people from abuses by the state. But at the same time, we also need to capacitate the state. The state, as you correctly say, as everybody correctly says, owns the largest amount of land. So why should national government be squeezed by a municipality to pay outrageous amounts when there's a greater public need for access to housing in the cities, for access to land for farm workers, for labor tenants, etc., etc. But again, people tend to equate this whole act with the issue of compensation. Compensation is only one part of it, and it provides for three categories. Is it market related? Is it partial? Is it full? Or is it nil? And it can be a mix of the two. You could get compensation according to market value for your house, but they may deduct the state investment on a property next door. But it's not a blank check, and it's quite specific to about 5 instances where there can be nil compensation. So again, it's not a blank check. It is also detailed around public interest as well. It's not a blank check. It says public interest, what does it equate to? Addressing the legacy of the past, inequalities, the issue of education, access to land, etc., etc. And the Constitution too speaks to that. So if somebody is aggrieved, they can go to court and say, no, this doesn't justify compensation because it is used to build a golf course, for example. And that person would win that in the court.
So, Ernst, one would then ask, because land dispossession is a huge issue in South Africa, and redress has been a conversation that has been going on for quite some time. How does AfriForum envision that the process of, redress should happen, in your view?
Right. So firstly, I just want to open with a quote from Albert Camus, the philosopher, who said, "The welfare of the people in particular has always been the alibi of tyrants, and it provides the further advantage of having the servants of tyranny giving them a good conscience." And I refuse to be a servant of tyranny. I'm glad Mr. Pretorius also refuses to be one. And it's very strange. I mean, to tell us for the 10th, 12th, 15th time, trust the government, this time it will be different. 15 times the charm, 20 times the charm. Where's the threshold? Where's the end of your patience is my question here. I mean, trust the snake oil salesman. His 20th product is going to be the real deal. You test the patience and the intelligence of the audience of this show, really. It's phenomenal. And then I just wanted to add there, Mr. Parks, I'm quite shocked by your personal attacks against Mr. Pistorius here. Now, just saying that he is an apartheid apologist and saying he wishes for apartheid is egregious, just prejudiced attack against a person you know from no place at all. That type of smearing no longer works. It just shows your facts are absent. It shows you've run out of facts and now you start attacking the man. I think that's an awful way to go about it. And I just want to say it's very comfortable, my position, and Mr. Pistorius's as well. The fact that we are standing on very principled ground. Expropriation without compensation was wrong in the past, and it's wrong in the present. You and Mrs. Hall are standing on very shaky ground, trying to argue that it was wrong in the past and perfectly fine in the present. I don't envy your position. I think it's quite precarious. What is AfriForum's solution? AfriForum's solution is, firstly, politicians need to stop using land as a political weapon. It is cruel, it is immoral, and it needs to cease immediately. It causes political instability. It worsens race relations. It is horrific behavior. Stop it. What needs to be done is the restitution process in place that is there to restitute land to those who were dispossessed in the past needs to be fixed and made functional. AfriForum supports the restitution process in place. Fix it. Don't try to now create another avenue that is only an avenue for the destruction of private property rights. And that's AfriForum's solution. And I think it's very reasonable. It is, and I hope that sane heads will prevail.
I'm going to go around the room. We're out of time in about 30 seconds each. I'm starting with you, Ernst, right on that point. You say you do not have confidence in the government and the fact that they can fix it, but at the same time, you're saying fix the process of land restitution. How do they fix it when you do not have confidence in them?
When someone is running a failed business, you don't ask them to start another business. You tell them fix your business first, and then you get the opportunity for a loan for a second business. The government is in charge of the restitution process, correct, but they need to fix it before they want any more responsibilities when it comes to land. This is the same government behind Eskom, the same government behind the post office, the same government behind every single failed SOE, and you want to put it in charge of land? I think that sounds like that quote from Albert Einstein, who said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
All right. Matthew, 30 seconds.
Sure. Look, I think Ernest is right. We need to fix the restitution process. There's no doubt about that. And the Expropriation Act is one tool to assist in the process. It's not going to resolve everything. There's additional other measures you need to do. Put in place resources, provide support for emerging farmers, etc., etc. This is one useful tool. But again, this is not going to see, let me be blunt, Afrikaner farmers being dispossessed in the millions. It's not going to do it, because a farmer can say, I have a productive farm, here's my legal claim to it, here's the people I employ, here's the public benefit to that community, etc. And if the state will have to compensate them, yes, it will be on market value. But if the land is state-owned, if the land has been abandoned, if the land is idle, or if there's overinvestment by the state which has benefited the owner, then the state can come with nil compensation or partial compensation. So it's not a pamphlet, it's not a slogan, it's an incredibly detailed, well thought out of act, helped draft by some of the most respected lawyers, constitutional lawyers in the country of all political backgrounds. And I think it's in line with international norms. It will go to the Constitutional Court, and we can bet you right now it'll pass the Constitutional Court. But again, the critical thing is not to have this debate today. It's about how to really collectively, society, address the need for land in our cities, in our townships, in our farm areas, address the need for land in our rural areas, because we don't do that. If we continue, as Ernest says, to think we can repeat what we've done in the past, expect better results, then we're going to be in serious trouble.
Let me come to you, Hermann, because Matthew says it will stand legal scrutiny. That's what he says.
I mean, good luck. It doesn't quite meet a simple reading of Section 25(2) of the Constitution, nor does the consultation and public participation processes for the National Assembly and National Council of Provinces meet muster. Now, the problem here is that there are 9.6 million black South Africans living on land that they have no title deeds for. This bill does nothing to empower them. The problem with aspirational home ownership is that you actually need to believe that you're working towards an asset. If you and I were in a relationship and I would say I have the right to at some point abuse you, would that be a red flag or a green flag in the possible relationship? And this is exactly what Matthew and Professor Hall are saying. Her credibility might be incredibly impressive, but her analysis is simply wrong on this particular issue. Land expropriation and the destruction of property rights was wrong in 1913, it was wrong in 1950, and it is wrong in 2024. The solution is to make sure that the state actually has a sensible land audit, because the land audit data currently isn't worth the paper it's written on. This bill does nothing for that. And also to make sure that the black South Africans who suffered under apartheid can actually say, I now live in a country where what I own is what I worked hard to earn. And this bill undermines that. And I would challenge Professor Hall, if she says this is a very clear-cut bill, why then the open list? There's no and in that list of grounds for expropriation of nil compensation. She's got legal knowledge. I would love her answer to why it isn't an open list.
Let's get her to answer that as a final question then. Prof. Hall?
Fantastic. I'm just very pleased that nobody in this panel will be involved in the adjudication of this act. It will no doubt go all the way to the Constitutional Court. I think part of the outcry from some groups to this act, including political parties that were part of the consultations and gave input to its revision over many years, the outcry seems to be perhaps something of a fundraising fishing trip in order to drive a litigation around this. I think that's what we're seeing, because we're seeing hyperbole, very overblown responses. It will go to the Constitutional Court. I look forward to the Constitutional Court giving a sensible ruling on it. But most importantly, we have a new land court that is strengthened, that has mediation capacity, it has permanent judges, and it will be adjudicating, I am sure, on a case-by-case basis, this question of which circumstances warrant fair compensation. All must be fair. So when is it market related and when is it not?
So the Act isn't a closed list, as you claimed earlier.
All right, let me thank you all for your time. It certainly, has been quite a fascinating discussion to hear from all of you. And as you all say, let's see what happens then when it reaches the courts, what kind of ruling is made. But thank you so much to you all for really just participating in this debate this afternoon. That is Ernst van Zyl with AfriForum, Matthew Parks, Cosatu spokesperson, Hermann Pretorius here with us in studio with the South African Institute for Race Relations, as well as Professor Ruth Hall with the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies.